So is it better to buy a car or lease a car? This is a question that comes up quite often when talking about finances and vehicles. And the reason why this comes up so many times is because it's kind of disputed and people don't really know why, is there one set in stone? Is leasing a car always better or is buying a car always better? And the reason why that's so disputed is because it depends on your situation. So let's cover that in this video to decide for you what your situation is, what your goals are, and then you can decide by the end of this video what you are better off doing, because not everybody's going to be best off leasing a car, not everybody's going to be best off buying a car, and that's what you're going to find in this video. So it really depends on what type of person you are and your goals that you have. So let's first talk about what a lease is. I think most people understand this, so we're just going to touch on this super briefly. A lease, well, you're essentially, I like to think of it as renting a car. Instead of buying it, you don't own the vehicle, you don't have equity in the vehicle, and so you're going to have it for a couple years and then you're going to give it back. It's basically renting. It's just the easiest way to understand that in a quick little brief moment. So let's talk about some of the pros and some of the cons of buying a car versus leasing a car and some of the benefits of leasing a car. So one of the biggest benefits of buying a car is quite obvious. It's that you are building equity in that vehicle, and that really is beneficial for a lot of people. So if you buy a car outright, which not many people do, most people are going to finance it somehow. Maybe they're going to get a 3 or 5 year auto loan for that vehicle. But say that you buy that car, at some point you're going to own that car. Maybe it's 5 years down the road, maybe it's longer than that if you have to get a longer auto loan. But at some point you own that vehicle and you can sell that vehicle and you can get money from that vehicle. So you can sell it for $10,000, $15,000 after 6 or 7 or 8 years, and you're gonna have some cash in your pocket. Now it's still a depreciating asset, really depreciating fast, but you will have cash in your pocket at some point in the future. When you're leasing a car, you don't have that option because you're gonna be paying these monthly payments, but you're not actually building equity in that vehicle. So when you think about it that way, you kind of think, well, I want to be building equity. I want to sell that car at some point in the future and make some money back. And that is true in many cases, but it's not always the best option. Now, another benefit of buying a car versus leasing it is that you have essentially unlimited mileage. So there's no mileage restrictions on that. Typically, when you lease a car, the dealership or the leasing agent is going to tell you, okay, you can drive up to 10,000 miles a year, maybe it's 12,000, maybe it's 15,000 miles per year, might be flexible on those terms, but generally speaking, there's going to be a cap on how far you can drive with that vehicle, and if you go over that, you're gonna have to pay a certain cents on the mile for any miles you go over that limit, which might be 12,000 miles per year. So when you buy a vehicle, you can do whatever you want with it. You can drive back and forth across the country 1,000 times if you want to. You can drive for Uber and not have to worry about racking up miles on your vehicle, but when you're leasing a car, you just can't quite do that, and you will be restricted to those miles. So if you find yourself driving a lot, maybe you have an hour commute to work, leasing a car might not always be the best option if you're driving well over 12 or 15,000 miles per year. You want to keep that in mind. You can also customize your vehicle when you own it. So when you're leasing a car, it's really kind of difficult to put on some serious customizations, where when you own your vehicle, you can spray paint a big smiley face on your hood or tint your windows and plastic dip your car pink if you want to, and it's your vehicle, so you can do that. But when you're leasing it, it's going to be more difficult to make those customizations on that vehicle without having some issues with the dealership or having to pay some fees or some fines at the end for having some crazy, completely different vehicle than what you began leasing it. So if you like to customize your car, you want to be crazy with it, you want to put flames on the side of it, you might want to buy that vehicle instead of leasing it. And if you do buy a vehicle, at some point you will not have to pay those monthly payments anymore. So if you're not buying it in cash and you're doing some type of financing where you have an auto loan for a few years, well, at some point you're not going to have to pay it anymore, and you're going to completely own the vehicle. When you're leasing vehicles, if you're planning on leasing a vehicle your entire life, you're always going to have those monthly payments that might be a few $100s a month depending on what kind of vehicle you get. But those are essentially the benefits of buying a car. What are some negatives, some downsides to buying a vehicle? And one of them, and one of the most obvious, is you're going to have warranties that expire, and you're going to have maintenance that you're going to have to keep up with. So say that your alternator breaks because the car is 8 years old and you need a new alternator, or you need new spark plugs, you need some new brake lines and new tires and whatnot. And so it's going to cause a lot of issues for you, and it can really creep up on you, and all of a sudden you can have $1,000, $2,000 in things you have to pay for in the auto shop when you actually buy a vehicle. When leasing vehicles, most vehicles that you're leasing are new. They're probably 2018, 2019 vehicles, maybe 2017 in some cases, but they're pretty new vehicles. And so because of that, you're not gonna have many issues, or you shouldn't have many issues with the actual logistics of the car. There's obviously so many moving parts in a vehicle, and as most people know, if you've had a car, cars break all the time. There's gonna be problems with vehicles. And when you own that car, once it gets older, you will have problems with it, and when you own the vehicle, you're gonna have to cover all those costs, and that kind of does suck in a lot of cases. Now, another downside to buying a car is that you, in some cases, depending on what state you live in, where you live in the country, or even what country you live in, you're going to end up paying more in sales tax overall when you actually buy a car versus leasing a car. And like I said, this depends on the state, so you can look this up in your individual state. I'm not going to list all 50 states here, but you do want to keep that in mind, that when you're buying a car, you're going to be paying all that sales tax up front. And if you live in a place where it's 8, 9, 10% sales tax on some items, that's going to be a lot of money. If you live in Montana, on the other hand, it might not be as much. Actually, I don't think they have any sales tax in Montana. So in that aspect, it might almost be better buying a car in Montana versus buying a car in something like LA, where you can have a lot more in sales tax. That's why you see those supercars from Montana. You see Lamborghinis and Ferraris with Montana license plates. It's because they don't have to pay sales tax in Montana, so they open up a business up there, and it's a whole operation how they actually avoid that sales tax. But you want to keep that in mind when thinking about buying versus leasing a vehicle. Now, generally speaking, when you are buying a vehicle, you're going to be paying more in monthly payments than you would when you're leasing a vehicle. Now, this is not set in stone. This obviously depends on many different factors, how long your lease is and how long your auto loan might be. But in many cases, say, for example, your potential lease could be $300 a month for the vehicle, or if you bought the car and you financed it for maybe a 5-year loan or a 3-year loan, it might be $500 or $400 a month. So you generally will pay a little bit more in monthly payments when you're actually financing that vehicle versus leasing the vehicle. And that's something that a lot of people do like when they lease a vehicle, that they can pay lower monthly payments and lower upfront costs to actually get the vehicle in their hands, in their garage, so that they can start driving it with less money up front. But a downside to leasing a vehicle, and hopefully you're keeping up with all these pros and cons of each of these, but a downside to leasing a vehicle is that it does typically require a little bit of a higher credit score, a little bit of a better established credit than financing a vehicle and actually buying that vehicle and financing it. And so you want to think about that, because in some cases, if you have bad credit, it's going to be easier to buy it through financing than it will be to lease a car. In a lot of cases, you do need to have pretty good credit in order to lease that. So if you have terrible credit, maybe you want to think about buying it. But now let's talk about how leasing can actually be beneficial for you, because we talked about all the pros and cons of buying a car. So what's so great about leasing? Well, I think one of the greatest benefits to leasing a vehicle is that if you are the type of person who likes to have a new vehicle every few years, so you like to have the newest vehicle, you don't want something that's 10, 15 years old, a beater car as they call it, then you might want to really consider leasing a vehicle. And this is where we really said that it depends on what your goals are and what type of person you are. If you want to have that new vehicle, if you want to have a vehicle that you don't have to worry about breaking down the side of the road because it's relatively new, then leasing is probably a good option for you. And the reason for that is because leases typically last 2 to 3 years, maybe a little bit longer if you want, but in a lot of cases they're pretty short leases, and you're gonna have that new vehicle, at which point you can trade it in and get a new vehicle after that 2 to 3 years and continue to get that upgraded, newest technology car that you might want in your life. And you don't have to worry about those incredibly expensive repairs on a vehicle. You don't have to worry about being upside down on a loan. This is what happens when people buy cars and they end up upside down on car loans, or they sometimes call it underwater on car loans. This doesn't happen all the time, but it can happen where you might owe $30,000 on your car, but it's only worth $20,000. That's called being upside down. You don't want to be in that situation. That's when you buy a car and it devalues so faster than what you're paying off, and you end up really being in a hole. Then if you try to sell the car for $20,000, you still owe $30,000, you got to come up with an extra 10 grand. It can be problematic for people, and that's why leasing can be simpler. But I want to caution you on this: when you actually trade in that car at the end of the lease, while it might seem easier where you don't have to worry about selling the vehicle, they can still tack on a lot of fees on top of that. If, say, you dented up the car, you scratched it up, you beat it up, the seats are torn, you're going to have a lot of fees you're going to have to pay on top of that to fix that car, to get it up to par so that they can resell that car. So that is essentially the differences between the two. Like I said, there's not going to be one set in stone, but really, if you are planning on getting a new car every few years, you're going to want to really consider leasing a car. And you can actually map this out through multiple different dealerships, you can see how much it's actually going to cost you over the car's lifetime. But if you want to buy a car and save a lot of money, your best bet in many cases is to buy that vehicle and then run it into the ground and drive it for 15 years or so, 10 years. But you want to think about buying that car not fresh off the lot, but actually a few years after it was released. So we're about in 2019 now, so you could buy a 2016 or a 2015 car after it lost its serious depreciation, because the first few years are the highest rate of depreciation, and then it sort of slows down, not quite plateaus, and then the depreciation goes much slower at that rate. It still depreciates pretty quickly though, to be honest with you, but that is your best bet there. So if you're really trying to get the most bang for your buck, you want to think about buying a car that is a few years old and then driving that car for the next 10 years or so, and then selling it at a point where it hits that next level of depreciation. But that is the gist of this video. So thanks for watching the video. Leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see everybody next time.